More than 6 months after ex-officer Derek Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years for the murder of George Floyd, the federal trial for 3 officers who were with Chauvin that day and who did not stop him began today. The 3 officers are accused of willfully failing to intervene to help George Floyd. It's an aspect of a police culture that will ultimately be put on trial, as some of the officers' defense attorneys are expected to place the full blame on Chauvin. The trial also comes as some expect President Biden may shift part of his focus back to criminal justice reform since suffering major defeat last week on voting rights. However, police reform may prove tricky when violent crime seems to be surging in some cities. Here's what Biden said at a U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting on Friday.
We shouldn't be cutting funding for police departments. I propose increasing funding so they can hire more social workers, folks trained in mental health, so they can partner with trusted community leaders.
And then you have the mayor of a very progressive city, New York City, moving back to a very problematic policing tactic that was the cause of all sorts of problems. Just days after 2 officers were shot, one fatally, after responding to a 911 call, Mayor Eric Adams, a former cop, announced the return of a modified plainclothes police anti-gun unit that was disbanded in 2020. That has drawn fierce backlash from those who point out that several deaths of black men like Eric Garner, Sean Bell, Amadou Diallo, and others were from plainclothes officers. Joining me now to discuss is retired LAPD sergeant and author of Chronicles, the greatest crime story never told, Dorsey. So, Sergeant Dorsey, what do you make, I'll start with the last part we just talked about. What do you make of Eric Adams' plan to bring back a modified version of the plainclothes anti-gun units to the police?
Well, listen, I wouldn't have a problem with him bringing back this unit as long as he doesn't staff it with what I like to refer to as the elephant hunters. Those are the guys that, you know, the hard chargers, the kick butt, take name kind of guys, the ones who created all those problems in the first place because they got personally invested when somebody didn't come here or turn around, and then we wind up with a death on our hands. And so you've got to have the right temperament when you staff those sorts of specialized units.
Well, how do you ensure that that works out? Because, you know, he's going to make this decision at the executive level of the mayor, but who gets put onto those units will be made at the precinct level, and he won't even know. And you know how this is going to work. The people who want to do that sort of work, the people who want to hunt the elephants, those are the ones who are going to raise their hand and say, I want to do this. I can't believe that I didn't get a chance to do it for a year or 2, and I want to be back on this beat.
And that's why it's so problematic when they talk about, you know, mayors and politicians talk about the kinds of reform that they want to make, because police chiefs and police commissioners have tremendous autonomy and they decide those very critical issues. But listen, they know who the nuts are. They know who the elephant hunters are. They know those people out there that have racked up personnel complaints and excessive use of force complaints like they're gifts from a good friend. Those are the people you don't want on those units. And so they should set up some sort of criteria that requires somebody who's going to enforce the law reasonably, equitably, and fairly on those kinds of units, because they're going to be running willy-nilly through the streets. They'll be jumping out, gaffling folks up, and then just dusting them off and leaving them. And you won't even know who they are, maybe in some instances, because they are plain clothes.
So I'm going to shift gears here to the federal government. What do you make of Biden's, the reports anyway, that Biden may be shifting his attention now to police reform, maybe do some things by executive order? Maybe there's no coincidence that it's going to be happening around Black History Month. But, you know, what do you think he can do effectively through executive order that will have a meaningful impact on local policing? Because, you know, as you know, this, you know, every police unit, every police force is its own entity. It's not federally controlled.
Well, I mean, he can certainly allocate funds that would be beneficial for training, so that officers are able to conduct and comport themselves in a way that keeps them safe when they respond to the types of calls that caused the life of these, at least one officer there in New York over these last few days. Domestic violence, traffic stops are always problematic, and officers need to be better prepared and understand what they're getting into when they go into those calls. Those were young officers on the job, and I don't want to second guess their training, but certainly training is an issue. When Biden talks about professionals and social workers, that's great and good, but we don't have the luxury of freezing frame and calling out a professional, a clinician, when we're dealing with someone with mental issues. And so that would be helpful, but I don't know if that's really realistic to stop the kinds of problems that we're seeing day in and day out with patrol officers.
Do you think the two sides of this can find any sort of common ground? There is the Black Lives Matter side that says, you know, policing is problematic as it has evolved, that there's a culture around it that is self-protecting, you know, that it is hard for it to reform itself, that we need to reallocate some funding around policing, and also to reform it as best we can. And then there's now a whole kind of raft of politicians, including liberal ones, who say, we're not talking about any of that now because we see increased numbers of homicides in some major cities, and we're going to throw more money, like Biden just said, at policing, not less. Is there any way to deal with the issues that we face in a kind of comprehensive way, or is this like a seesaw? When one thing goes up, the other one's going to go down?
That's typically what happens, and I think that's what will happen here. But I mean, if we had folks who were willing to have an honest dialogue about the problem, and we know that there are officers out there who should not be, who don't have the skill set or the temperament to do this job, when you identify those folks, you don't let them stay on the job and rack up 27 personnel complaints like Derek Chauvin and others. Daniel Pantaleo, that wasn't his first rodeo before he choked Eric Garner to death. And so they have to have an honest conversation at the commissioner level about who's problematic on your department. You know who they are, get them out of the ranks, and then work to train and recruit others who have a mind to change the quality of life for the citizens without being abusive in the process.
Right. We have about a minute left. I want to get your, you brought up Chauvin, I want to get your opinion on this trial that is starting today. You know, these three officers are basically being tried for not intervening, what they did not do. How strong do you think that case is against people for not taking an action rather than taking one?
Well, I guess it's going to depend on how the jury perceives this. But listen, every police officer, no matter how much time you have on the department, once you get out of a police academy, you're a full-fledged 100% police officer, and you absolutely have a duty to intervene. And any one of them, all of them should have stopped Derek Chauvin if they had the intestinal fortitude to do that. That should not have occurred. And so I'm hopeful that they too will be held accountable for their failure to intervene.
Sergeant Dorsey, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your time as always.